All right, Cyber Patriots, let's talk about our first intro into Linux. We'll look at some slides, some of them. We won't go through all of these. Just get introduced to some of the concepts, and then in the subsequent video, we'll touch on some of the security features and be ready for class and ready for competition and getting started with this really neat operating system that's very important for the cybersecurity professional. All right, so we're going to talk about the basics of Linux, the nature, the architecture, differences and similarities with Windows. We'll touch on some of those, or some things that are familiar, but there are some key differences. An overview, terms and definitions, some architecture, and so on. And the command line, we'll talk in general about sudo, but we won't go into too much detail on that just yet. But it's an easy concept, and you'll get used to it quickly. All right, what is Linux? It's a family of operating systems. So we think of Windows, of course, that we've dealt with mostly to begin with. And the Windows is an operating system. Linux is actually a family. You have different distributions. You'll hear them referred to as distros. And they even come in families where some are derivatives of others. That can go on like almost like tracing somebody's family history that really deeply. So we won't go delve too deeply there, but we'll talk about a couple of key ones, and particularly the Ubuntu that we're going to hit the hardest in Cyber Patriot, and touch on one other that becomes important from a security practitioner's point of view. So it's a family of operating systems modeled off of an operating system called Unix. Unix is like the pay version, the commercial version of an operating system. Powerful stuff, incredibly resilient, really strong technology, also extremely expensive. Usually goes with some expensive hardware. So Linus Torvalds many years ago introduced Linux to the world, gave you a Unix-like environment, but it's free and open source. And so it's been built collaboratively. That's why you see so many different distributions of it. They get built and then they get modified for specialized purposes. And so it's kind of an open thing, but it also gives you a lot of freedom. We're going to talk a little bit about the Linux kernel, and why that's a little bit of a different concept from your traditional Windows users. So build an open source environment. That means that the source code, the way you write Linux, the behind the scenes programming, that's open and freely available. And then you can use it, modify it, redistribute it, whatever. Of course, with Microsoft and Windows and their other products, that's not true. That is proprietary stuff, and most software is. Then there's positives and negatives for why you would do the open source thing. But that's how the Unix community has gone. And it's grown a lot, and we're going to talk about the Linux kernel next. So when we deal with the Windows side of the world, we don't really have this concept because the kernel and the GUI that we interact with, all those things are kind of in one piece. You don't really get the Windows kernel and then add a Windows GUI on top of it, or a distribution package on top of it, and so forth. So in the Linux world, these things get broken out more. So the kernel is the core component of the OS. It deals with the system resources. That's probably the most important idea. It deals with how the memory is managed, the processes, the I/O devices, which that means putting output to your screen, taking input from the keyboard, sending it to the printer, going out through the network, and so forth. So that core stuff that happens, that isn't stuff you would directly interact with on the screen yourself, but it's what really makes an operating system an operating system. So you think of that as being where the CPU is, the devices, the memory, and so forth. And that's what the Linux actually is what we're calling the kernel. Not necessarily the start menu and the icons you see on a desktop and so forth. Now they're going to talk about different Linux operating systems, distributions, or distros. Of course, Ubuntu, last several years, has become extremely popular, very user-friendly, really easy to work with, not that hard for a Windows user to get comfortable with the Ubuntu environment. There's Mint, there's Red Hat. Red Hat's one. I've dealt with Red Hat a lot in one job back, where it's kind of like the, I guess, the industrial strength server version that's extremely popular. There's Fedora. They're not talking about SUSE. That one's also pretty popular from a business enterprise application standpoint. There's Fedora. They're saying that's a version of the Red Hat, a test bed. So no argument there. So you've got that, and then we're going to talk about Kali just briefly also. So these are flavors, distros, distributions, variations on the theme, but they all work basically similarly with just some variations depending on what kind of an application we use it for. And of course, like we've been talking about, Ubuntu is going to be our bread and butter during the Cyber Patriot competition. Now here's a couple of variations on the theme. So we have desktop environments. So this is where it's a little bit different from the Windows world, where you have separation of the kernel from the GUI. Unity is one desktop environment. It would give you one look and feel and set of icons and way of interacting with everything. Then they talk about Debian. You might remember we used Debian during, I think it was our first practice round. It uses GNOME. So you can see Unity over here. I'll close in a bit so that you can see that a little bit better. But the Unity that is often associated with the Ubuntu, they put the things along the left here, which really is kind of like you would think of having your shortcuts on the bottom of the hash bar. Hard to see, but there are things like the terminal where you get to go and type some stuff we'll talk about. There's a settings right there that's roughly translates to what we've been doing with the control panel. That's where you can get to a Firefox. There's some applications. There's an Office application suite that is popular on Linux. There's actually a couple of them, but they've already got like the Linux counterpart to Word, Excel, and so forth out there. That's the browser. And then there's for like settings and how you set up apps, creating new apps, almost like in a sense, kind of like the way an app store would work on a phone environment. And then you have the GNOME environment, where it's kind of a little bit closer to the more familiar things at the top menu system. We'll see that here in a minute. But again, it's what you see, the look and feel, that's the desktop environment. Unity up here, GNOME here. And then it's the Ubuntu or the Debian or whatever Linux variation is really what's happening behind the scenes. So here they finally mentioned Kali. So you get different purposes, different target audiences. Ubuntu and Debian for general audiences. Kali is used for security, auditing, and forensics. Kali is a variation of Debian that is used for security audits. It comes with a whole bunch of security tools already built in. When we get to the end of the season, we'll probably look at doing some of that. For those that have an interest in doing like security audit type work, we'll dive deeper with Kali and some of the tools you get into when you work with Kali. 32 versus 64-bit, they both do that. And they have different package management and installation. So you've got different tools that are used to put the new stuff on there. So if you need to go and download a different Office application, or you want to grab the other browser or download some security tool or what have you, the way that you do that works differently depending on which one of the package management tools you have. So differences with Windows: less expensive. It's open source, so there's no cost like there would be with Windows, which you traditionally buy it with your new computer. But if you have to go and upgrade, there's a cost, of course, to proprietary software. The GUI can be changed, so we've talked about that because it's not tied to the kernel. So if you like if, for example, you really like the GNOME interface more than Unity, you can change that on there. With Windows, you don't really move around the GUI. I mean, Windows is Windows, and you've got the GUI, like what we see here on my machine. You've got that, and that's just how the thing works. Some things can only be done on the command line. We'll talk about that very briefly in this one and a little bit more in the next. But there are some things where you almost have to do stuff on command line. There'll be a handful of commands that we'll need to get comfortable with for Cyber Patriot, but definitely not something to get worried or intimidated by. It'll be good exposure, and there'll be a handful we'll get used to as we dive a little bit deeper in the Linux world. Interesting point here: less malware on Linux. Since most organizations still use Windows, those systems are more lucrative targets for attackers. Sometimes the Linux community develops and distributes patches more quickly than Microsoft and Apple. So in some ways, maybe a bit a more secure environment, simply because there's more installations of Windows. That makes it more interesting to the aggressive side of the hacking community. And also because the open source makes it a little bit easier to be responsive, because you've got, in a lot of ways, many more people working on doing those things and getting those patches corrected, as opposed to Microsoft that pretty much holds to their once-a-month schedule. And every now and then we'll do something in an out-of-band patch when they patch something, when they distribute a patch, right then and there. So good points they're making there. Some hardware doesn't work with Linux, and a few of them we've talked about, like putting Linux on a laptop, which I strongly encourage, and I'm here to help with doing that. We've done that with a couple of folks already. But occasionally we run into some oddball things where the hardware just won't work right. In fact, I've got one of the two laptops where the Wi-Fi is not working. One it's working beautifully, one it's not. Could be a hardware issue, but just sometimes you run into some stuff like that. Here they're showing LibreOffice. That's like the answer to Microsoft Office. Works really well. I've actually used the Windows version of LibreOffice before because it works, to me, every bit as well as Office does, but it's free. You can save file format so that the Word-like documents you would create, you can be used with Word. It's totally compatible. Same with the spreadsheet, Excel counterpart application. Works really, really well as a Office, as a productivity tool, and comes built in on the, you can actually see it. I'll go back up to this Ubuntu in Unity. Actually, that's what a couple of those icons are, is icons for the Microsoft Word counterpart, the Microsoft Excel counterpart that you have in LibreOffice. And they're making the point that you can find programs that work like things you're used to. LibreOffice is like Microsoft Office. You've got Thunderbird. There's some others that works kind of like Microsoft Outlook would. So if there's something out there that you like to do, you can usually find a good variant on it. Okay, some terminologies and concepts. So in the Linux world, we don't talk about the administrator account. We talk about root. And we'll talk, and you'll even hear in the hacking competition world, you hear about getting root, like getting root access, like I've hacked you. So I'm doing what we call the root dance. When I was in a hacking class years ago, that's we had to do a root dance when we got into a system. And so root's the end-all be-all user account, and so we'll get into using it and how you access that account. We'll talk about that also in just a little bit. Requires a password anytime you do a root action. We'll see that. That's a little bit different from the Windows world, where once you're logged on as an admin, you're an admin and everything just works with an admin function. With Linux, it handles that a little bit differently. And you could consider that either annoying, or you could consider that that's a little bit more secure. Authentication versus authorization, we'll get to that later, although I think we've been over that some. Okay, so that's how we've got root as opposed to administrator. Now let's talk about the file system a bit. So in our prior work, we've noticed where we've tended to, when we're looking for things in the scenarios where someone's got a file that doesn't belong there, we go through those home folders where it's under the profiles and the person's username, and then there might be documents and downloads and those other subfolders within someone's profile. So first of all, notice in Windows, it's like a C:\\\, and a lot of times there'd be actually like a username and then whichever profile we're under and so forth, and then documents and hello.txt or whatever the bad file was we were doing in the scenario. Now notice in Linux, it uses // instead of backslashes, and then you've got this home folder that's going to be more like that profile where we kept things on the Windows side. So in Linux, we'll have this home folder, and there will be the username and then whatever the name of the file is that we're trying to check out, like if it's bad or if it's something that's malicious, whatever the scenario is calling for us to look for. They mentioned a couple of them here. There's the home folder, which is where the user's documents, files, and so forth. And the boot that has startup files. There's a couple of other key ones like the, there's a passwd folder, and there's another folder that's used, and I'm forgetting the name of it right offhand, that keeps the encryption for the passwords. But there's a handful of folders that we'll have to talk about that will probably come into play in competition. Adding and removing software, we use packages. I'm not going to go into this in detail. We'll talk about that in class, but there are packages that load things up. And again, honestly, it's almost kind of between the add and remove programs in the Windows environment and something like your App Store that you would be used to on your phone in the Android or Apple environment. Actually, it works pretty well. You can see it has little rating systems, and the install stuff works well. So it's kind of a good way that they have it set up with the maturity of the ecosystem. Okay, Ubuntu command line. I'm going to touch on this just briefly because, as we noted above, there are things that can only be done from the command line in the Linux environment. Now, they're first going to talk about pros and cons of the command line environment. So, first of all, you can see there's a, let me explode this out a little bit. You can see this is something where someone's gone to a command line. It just means you're going to have to type stuff instead of pointing and clicking. No big deal there. We'll get used to doing the handful of commands we need. The pros of using it this way: more control. There's things where you can do some switches and stuff to make things work exactly like you want them to, as opposed to being stuck with whatever's there in the point and click. Save some time because it requires a keyboard. Yeah, that can be true. Less processing power because of the GUI. And can be made easier with scripting. That's very true. There's some things you can do to automate if something is a repeated process. There's a thing you want to do to every user. Well, going and having to click through 100 users to change one setting, that can get tedious. If you can learn to script and do that one setting and then just feed all the users into the script, it can speed your work up a lot. Now, against the command line, not as user-friendly. You've got to memorize stuff, or you've got to go look things up to figure out how to get the same text right. And it's harder to multitask because you can't get one thing running and minimize it like you can in the GUI. So, the biggie is the user-friendly part. The multitasking, you get past that fairly quickly. But it is different because it's not right there in front of you, point and click the thing you need. You've got to actually have a little bit of facility with knowing which command and so forth. And then, did they talk about the case yet? No. Okay, accessing terminals. So there's a couple of ways, but you can kind of see down here one of the icons cranks it up depending on whether you're in GNOME or Unity or which one of the browser interfaces. At the beginning, it's usually straightforward. I don't think we'll have any trouble with that. Yeah, here's the capitalization. So when you're using terminal, and actually anytime you're dealing with text in the Linux environment, notice what they say here. First thing, when typing commands in terminal, it is very important to pay attention to capitalization and spaces. Watch the capitalization. In Windows, passwords, of course, are case sensitive. You know, if you're typing a password and you shift it when you shouldn't and it's lower versus upper, that matters. Other things, if you're typing stuff at a C prompt or doing a search function in Windows, case sensitivity will rarely be a problem. In Linux, it does. So if you're looking for a file, like for example, let's go back up to our example that they were showing, the users file. Okay, so for example, if we were searching for this document in Windows and we searched all of the C drive and we looked for hello.txt, it wouldn't matter when we typed this into the search feature if we did capital H or lower h or whatever. In Linux, if we did a search and we put a capital H instead of a lower h when we did a search in the Linux, it would not find that file. The case sensitivity, we'd have to make sure that if the file's name is all lowercase, we search and work with it in all lowercase. Just something you get used to. That's burned us at work not long ago. We're working on our phone system and trying to fix something and doing a search for something and couldn't find something we knew was there. And it finally hit us. Oh yeah, this uses some Linux stuff on the back end. We've got to get case sensitivity right. So we've just got to get used to that in the Linux world. Hitting enter command will create something. Control D will close any command you have running, and Control D will come into play in a bit on something else too. And there's a few sites on command databases. Those are everywhere. Probably when you get into this for real, you probably want to just get a reference book or get used to going to doing what are called man pages. We'll talk about that in a later session. There they reference them for the Ubuntu. And there's a couple others they mentioned, and I know the man pages are really good. They're kind of like the dictionary, but anything else under the Ubuntu community stuff is pretty good also. Sample commands on using the cat, we are not going to go into that just yet, but I do want us to see, okay, and there's the grammatical analogy again. I don't think that's necessary where we are now, although I do want to touch conceptually on this one command. Called sudo. Sometimes we hear people call it sudo. It is the SU part is super user and then do. So I want to be a super user and do something. So you're going to run a command, but you're going to run a command as a super user. So I go with the sudo pronunciation because you're going to do something. You're not going to super user do something. You're going to super user do something. You go in forums and see people go back and forth on that, but I go with the traditional sudo, and most of the Unix guys I've known have. But if you hear someone say sudo, there's a they can make an argument for that, and that's fine. So if you want to do something like they're doing add user, so there's an add user at a command prompt. They're in the terminal. They're trying to create a user, and they hit enter, and it says you'll get the error message below because you've not authenticated. You've not said you're trying to do something that affects the system, but you don't have the rights to do it yet. So you're going to get a message, and now you do it like this: sudo, and then you do the add user. So it's the same command as before, add user Archimedes, but you said let's do it as the super user. And so when you give it that prompt to say I'm the super user, sudo, and then I'm going to add a user, I want the user named Archimedes, hit enter. Then it's going to ask you for the password for the user account you have that's got not administrator but root level access, and then it will fulfill the command for you, and it will create your Archimedes user. So again, that's almost easy to correct. You'll try to do something, realize, oh yeah, that's right, that doesn't work. Well, what's the problem? You need to sudo the thing first. So get used to that. We'll get used to that pretty easily. Now you can also just go into sudo mode, and when you do that, everything you do will be done with your super user account with root level access. And like I mentioned, that Control D will get you back out of that mode. So they're typing sudo su, hit enter, and then you can notice they can do just add a user without typing the sudo part of it. Let you kind of stay in a series of elevated privilege functions without having to do the sudo every single time. And then you Control D to get yourself out again. And then they're here walking you through, look, we created a username Archimedes and another one named Riemann, that's some really cool mathematical references. And then they're going back and looking at the users and confirming that on the graphical side that yes, we did create them on the control panel, so at the command line side. And so we'll walk through some of that too. Okay, so that is that's the slide deck. And just real quickly, I'm going to pop up with what we have in Cyber Patriot, and this is going to be the what we look at first. This is actually the Linux version with kind of a cool background there. So notice this is Ubuntu, but notice we don't have the buttons along the left. So this is not the Unity interface, because I'm clicking up here for this stuff. This is actually GNOME, I believe, is what they've done to us. Is they've taken the GNOME desktop and put it on top of the Ubuntu kernel. So there's an example there where you can separate the kernel from the interface, or from the desktop environment. So a lot of the same things. Here are the system tools. So that's going to be pretty much a counterpart to our control panel. Sound and video, there's the office tools, your internet access, and there's Firefox, Thunderbird Mail, and so forth. Some accessory things that might have some stuff that we'll get into. Notice under accessories, there's terminal. And we get a terminal screen. And so there's the beginning of the command prompt. Notice the windows, there's the close, there's the minimize, there's the maximize. So that's a little bit different, but it's fine. So we'll get used to that as well. So that's going to conclude this first Linux entry, and we will do some more on specific things on Unix security and getting more detail into what we need to know for the competition. See you next time.